ABC Alice Springs.
And 106.1 in Tennant Creek, 99.7 in Yalara. Well, it's already screened overseas and in Sydney, but this weekend it will be the Red Centre's turn to watch John Pilger's latest film on the plight of Indigenous Australians. It's called Utopia. Here's the trailer.
We're about 200 miles from Alice Springs and heading into the red heart of Australia. It's a region known as Utopia, the poorest place in Australia. It's the home of the first Australians.
If they're part of our society too, they have to do the same as us.
I was waiting for a description of the concentration camp that was here. Historic rottenness, clay and stone.
We rounded people up into our own concentration camps.
No more whispering in our minds.
Welfare men found us and took us, and mothers were screaming and crying and hanging onto the truck when they drove us away.
We've got a lot of racist policies in our past, but this one was the mother-in-law.
John Pilger is the journalist behind that film Utopia, and I spoke to him a little earlier.
Good morning.
Why did you want to make this film?
Well, this film is long overdue. I've made something like 4 films on Indigenous Australia, and starting with The Secret Country in 1985. And when the intervention happened in 2007, which was one of the most savage assaults on Indigenous life, especially in the Northern Territory, it was then that I realised that I should return to the subject, and Utopia is the result.
I haven't actually seen the film yet. It's screening here in Alice Springs at Araluen this weekend. Who are some of the people specifically from Central Australia and the Utopia region that you've interviewed?
We really based ourselves around, apart from Alice Springs, but around Butterwatch, just on the edge of Utopia, and then went into the homelands or outstations. From there, with David Smith, the head of the Aboriginal Medical Services Clinic in Butterwatch, and so David is interviewed at work as he treats people with the kind of preventable diseases that I'd filmed almost 30 years ago. I mean, that was the extraordinary situation as far as I was concerned, that I was seeing virtually the same problems in terms of health for Aboriginal people in that part of Australia, indeed all over Australia. So it was looking at Utopia through the eyes of people who care for and the people in Utopia. Again, what was striking was the absence, in spite of David Smith and his team's great efforts, the absence of basic services in that area. We found overcrowding, lack of sanitation, lack of proper water supply, and so on and so forth, lack of a bush bus service. All those basic services that most Australians take for granted. We also filmed at Whitegate and spoke to the Felicity and Basil, the traditional owners at Whitegate, and I found that a remarkable situation. And Whitegate, of course, is under threat of eviction at the moment from the people, the remaining people there from the Northern Territory government. But almost total absence of services there was one of the most striking situations. I interviewed Rosalie Cunneth-Monks, who is one of the more distinguished elders and leaders of the community in Utopia. And Rosalie makes the point in Utopia, and she speaks for, I think, Aboriginal people right across the country, that unlike other countries with Indigenous populations, the Indigenous people of Australia never ceded anything. As she puts it rather ironically, we never ceded any land, anything, for a bunch of welfare. That until there is a treaty between Aboriginal people and the authority in Australia, that is the federal government. Australia distinguishes itself by being the only first world country with an Indigenous population that has never recognised their right to the land. I mean, yes, finally Terra Nullius went, and yes, there's native title and so on, but these are very troubled provisions. But the film is not only set in Utopia. Utopia has another distinction. It was in a government survey of a couple of years ago. It was named as the most disadvantaged place in Australia, whereas Barton in Canberra, where the Australian Parliament is, was named as the most advantaged place in Australia. So our journey began in Barton, and we went to Utopia, but the film is all over Australia.
What do you think, aside from a treaty, what do you think needs to be done? I think that for an audience here in Central Australia, people are very aware of the issues that are in remote communities. Also very aware that there are a lot of organisations doing a lot of good work, like the Central Australian Youth Link-Up Service are doing a lot to eradicate petrol sniffing. The Purple House have done a lot to educate people in remote communities about healthy lifestyles and what that means for avoiding kidney disease. So what do you think needs to be done?
Well, there are indeed very good organisations doing the kind of work you describe. But I would challenge your assertion that people know all about it, because if they know all about it, why do you have within a stone's throw from some of the wealthiest streets in Australia, let's say like, what is it, Cromwell Terrace and Alice Springs, some of the most disadvantaged and deprived communities, Australian communities in this country? I mean, the striking thing to me about Alice Springs is it's a relatively small place, but it's absolutely jam-packed with services such as this massive aquatic centre and all the other things that it has. You don't have to drive very far from Alice Springs. In fact, you can head off into the town camps and you see a very different Australia. Now, there's no doubt that there are a number of people aware of this, and there is no doubt there are a number of organisations doing good work, certainly Indigenous organisations as well as non-Indigenous organisations. But the fact that there are still two Australias, and Patricia Morton-Thomas, who I interviewed in Alice Springs, described it as an apartheid situation. And whenever I've been to Alice Springs, I'm reminded of my reporting from apartheid South Africa. Yes, it's different. There aren't the signs, but there are two different Australias, two different services, almost two different sets of attitudes. And there's also in Alice Springs, which is also very striking, there's almost an industry that if you actually took away the Aboriginal population, you took away all the town camps and all those nearby, there's a non-Indigenous industry, and I use that word almost ironically, that would absolutely collapse. You know, the black dollar, the contractors who are put up in hotels to go and build one house in a town camp for some enormous amount of money, the numerous consultants, people writing studies, what would they do without the Aboriginal population? It's a very interesting question for all Australians, but maybe especially for those in Alice Springs.
So what do you think needs to change? Who can, make the changes that you think needs to happen?
Well, we'd be on this interview all day and night, but I don't pretend to be an expert. There are experts. At the basis of this is, as I mentioned at the beginning of this interview, which Rosalie Cunniffe-Monks has brought up, that there has to be a basic treaty negotiated between all the Aboriginal nations right across Australia. And that treaty can't be any kind of woolly constitutional change that Prime Minister Abbott is planning at the moment. It has to be very, very concrete set of provisions. of rights to do with health and education and roads and access and housing. So it has to be a treaty negotiated between equals, and that treaty has to include very, very concrete rights.
Now, I have read articles sort of reviewing your film that a suggestion that might have come as a result of that is that the UN needs to maybe step in, or we need to have people from the outside of our country maybe taking an outsider's point of view and maybe helping us out here and telling us what to do. Is that the view that you take?
No, I haven't suggested the United Nations should come into Australia. The United Nations often comes to Australia, and Australia has probably been declared more racist than any other first rich country in the world by UN special reporters who come here, such as James Anaya in 2009. But Professor John Altman, who is a distinguished anthropologist and economist at ANU in Canberra, is interviewed by me in the film. And he says, in my darkest moments, I think that this problem, and it's a problem for non-Indigenous Australia, this problem has become so politicised, as he put it, and so acerbic, that we need help from outside. Now, he didn't define what that help should be, but of course the solution, and I'm sure he would agree with this, the solution has to come from inside Australia. But to go on with yet more rhetorical promises, pledges, and ploys is not going to work anymore in the 21st century, because what has happened is that many people around the world have now noticed that Australia does not comply with the most basic decencies as far as the treatment of its Indigenous people. That's been spotted. So it may not be help from outside, but there will be pressure from outside. I've no doubt about that.
John Pilger, you have been quite critical of the way of your perception of Alice Springs. For people who live in Alice Springs and have been here for a very long time, a majority of people, as you say, do probably work in the Indigenous health sector or welfare, a variety of areas, spend a lot of time out bush, even if they are based in Alice Springs. I would argue that a lot of people here in Alice Springs do have a very strong understanding of the issues that are involved.
I wasn't disagreeing with that. In fact, I agreed with you. I said that many people in Alice Springs do have an understanding, and there are some people doing some extraordinarily good work.
You also suggest that there is quite a strong divide, and you're talking that about an outsider's perspective there.
No, I'm not. I'm talking, unless, look, it's like arriving in South Africa. That's the same old story you used to get there. Hey, you're an outsider. Well, I'm not an outsider. I'm an Australian. And
how much time did you spend?
Play the games of insiders and outsiders. The divisions within Alice Springs, if they're not noticeable to the non-Indigenous population, I can assure you they're very noticeable to the Indigenous population.
I'm saying that a lot of people would identify that there are problems in Indigenous communities. I'm just wondering how much time you got to spend here. I know you spent time here in the past.
I've made 4 films over 30 years. I've probably been to more communities in and around the Northern Territories than many of my colleagues. I can't tell you in actual days, weeks and months that I've spent, but it's been a very long time over the years. And back I've gone, time and time again, to see it again. I don't believe journalists and filmmakers should parachute in, as it were, into situations. I think they should look at it over a period of time. And I've been coming to Alice Springs. I first came to Alice Springs in 1969 when I drove out to Jay Creek. So it's that long.
John Pilger, I'm looking forward to seeing your film. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me this morning.
All right, you're welcome.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
John Pilger is the director and journalist behind the new film Utopia, having a look at what has been done to tackle Indigenous disadvantage